my name is Julia and this is my YouTube channel where I talk about books, arts and museums. And today I'm reporting to you from the little town in Germany. It's called Winterberg. It is actually a little ski resort town which is very popular during the winter time. We decided to rent this beautiful house to celebrate the birthdays of our dear friends, but also because this weekend, let's say the 11th, 12th, 13th of August, is also the meteor shower, and it is a great opportunity to, lie down on the grass and see the night sky. And where we live, usually you don't see much because of the light pollution, but here it's relatively good. Actually, last night we've seen a couple of falling stars, which is basically meteors heating the atmosphere. But yeah, it was wonderful experience. So yeah, now my friends went for a little hike. Some of us staying here at home, and I decided to, steal some time to talk to you about books that I read last month. Yeah, consider it my little July wrap-up. Last month I read in total 8 books, which is, for me personally, it's a lot. But considering the fact that some of them are very small, maybe like over 100 pages, that was okay. That was manageable. And let's begin talking with them in chronological order, in order that I actually approached them and read them last month. And since I don't have books with me, I'm going to put the cover somewhere here, and just for your reference to understand what I'm talking about. Since it is a lot of books, I'll make timestamps in this video so you can navigate throughout the video if you want to skip some of them, if you're not interested in some of the subjects. So yeah, check out the timestamps and the description of the video and select what you want to watch. Anyways, I'll begin with the books that I've read first last month, and that was The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. If you watched my last wrap-up video, June wrap-up video, I told about the Rebecca Kuang Yellow Face novel, and I think this book actually sends a great message that we should maybe think about it. Who gets to tell the story and who has a right to tell the story of, for example, different nations or different ethnic groups. So this is probably one of the controversies when we talk about the author Lisa C, because as you might know, Lisa C is, well, she looks like a white woman, but she's actually 1/8 of Chinese. But again, Chinese heritage is not the same as Korean heritage and Korean stories. And of course, a lot of people challenge Lisa C whether she actually gets the right to tell the story of Asian people. We can literally fall into this rabbit hole in the discussion of who has the right to write the story. I don't want to take this responsibility and, let's say, disregard all the white people who are writing some sort of story of historical fiction or historical novels on other nations. Why? Because I think it is primarily the responsibility of this first filter, which are, let's say, the editors or the publishing houses, so people who choose, who select the authors and the stories. Now, however, when we already have these books, I think it is not easy just to disregard them altogether from the very beginning. So obviously I gave her a chance. Again, she's still 1/8 Chinese, and if she feels close to her, let's say, this part of her family history, that's fine by me. Yet for this book, she selected the story of Haenyeo, of sea women, of Jeju Island in South Korea. And she's done her research. She wrote a beautiful book, and I think for that we can be critical. It's always up to us, but I think as for responsible readers, we should just read other stories, especially stories from Korean people about Korean history, Korean heritage, or Korean traditions. So I always up to it. I always support all Asian authors writing about themselves, reflecting on their history and past and history. I love that. But if Lisa C selected it as her subject for her book, okay, good for you. And I also wanted to see actually what she's done with the story. And I would say I was surprised. I was surprised because it was a well-written book. I'm sure the editors has done also brilliant work. I like the story. I enjoy the carefulness with which she approaches the details of Korean history and Korean culture. I learned some new information that I never knew. So basically, whenever I encountered something unfamiliar to me, that brought me to Wikipedia and other historical sources that, also introduced me to the Korean history that I never knew. And we should give it to her. We should give it to her because she's done a great research, I'm sure. And even if she is a great expert in Chinese history, for example, it can be challenging to introduce oneself to the Korean history because it is completely different. For that, great job. It is well written. Maybe some of the episodes are quite naive, but some of the episodes of this book are so vivid and so memorable that I'm sure they will stay with me for a long, long time. I'm definitely open to read more literature on Haenyeo or on sea women and the history of Jeju Island, especially maybe next time I'll pick a non-fiction book. But as a little introduction to that community and to that little tiny area of our world, it was great. It was a great experience. It was easy to read, and I would recommend it to everybody. Of course, I would never limit myself to only this book in order to understand and be introduced into the culture and history of Haenyeo. And I'm really thankful that this book actually cemented in me this idea that I need to learn more, that when I travel to South Korea, I'll make sure that I go down to Jeju Island and I visit the Museum of Haenyeo. Maybe I'll, go see them in their villages. I'll certainly do that. I'm really thankful to this book that it opened up this little window. But again, I will continue also to introduce myself to Korean authors maybe who wrote about them, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. But that, I think, makes a really nice and smooth bridge to the next book, which is called Still Life with Rice. A young American woman discovers the life and legacy of her Korean grandmother by Helie. And this is an example of ethnic Korean person writing about Korean people. And my first expectation, I guess, was that this is the story of her discovering her history, maybe going to archives and asking her family members about what happened in the past. Something similar to the book that I read this year. It is called Two Trees Make a Forest, which is basically the reflection on the family past. However, my expectations were surpassed by Helie because this is not just her reflection, this is actually the history of her grandmother. I'm sure Helie took some freedom to maybe add some details on the history of her family in order for us to engage in this story, which for me it's no problem because family history is always a mystery because we never remember the things right, and if you build this legend around your family, it is your right, and if we enjoy it, that is the perfect combination, made in heaven. And I think this is this case. I would even say that this is one of my favorite books of this year. So it reminded me a lot of Pachinko, which is probably my favorite book of all times. But the difference between Pachinko and Still Life with Rice is Pachinko is a very great masterpiece of a family saga, while Still Life with Rice is a great example of the story of one person. So she doesn't actually dive into this generational trauma, let's say, or how it affected the next generations, although you can actually, let's say, interpret it in that way. Nevertheless, this book is a pure masterpiece in my humble opinion, and considering the fact that it was written in the 90s, I think it was published in the 97s, something like that, and I believe that it was unfairly forgotten by book community, and this is my little mission to actually make you read this book. Because again, if you love Pachinko, I'm sure you would enjoy Still Life with Rice. And Helie was probably one of the pioneers of diving into not just Korean history, but the Korean history of women, which is a very difficult subject to research. And probably the only source is always the women themselves. Me, as a person who is also trying to, dive in the history of one's family, I understand that it's an immense work and it requires a lot of information, a lot of time, a lot of strength, a lot of sources and communication. So I appreciate what Helie did. I love the book. I love how she weaved this little details of Korean history and Korean traditions into this very personal story. And there were so many moments when I was about to cry. It was, heartbreaking because of the history again, but also the way she introduced us to this personal history. So I absolutely love it. And if you're looking for something like family story, if you're interested in Korean history specifically, if you love pachinko, I think you should definitely pick that book. And I do believe that this book probably needs, like new edition, new covers, like new promotion, everything, because it's worth it. It's worth it, and I adore it. I love it. And thank you very much, Helie, for doing this wonderful job. Now I want to interrupt my chronological order and actually talk about the book that I read a little bit later that month, but that is also about Korean self-identity and partially Korean history. And this is the book of Alexander Chee. It is called How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. Basically, it is a collection of autobiographical essays by Alexander Chee, as I mentioned. There he describes some of the most important moments in his life that define him as an author and as a person. His realization of his queerness, for example, his self-identification as a half-Korean person living in America, and obviously his reflection on his writing. As I said in my TBR video, I haven't read his fictional works. His probably most famous novel is Edinburgh, and in this autobiographical essays, he actually writes and reflects a lot on this book. Probably for me, it was difficult to understand what he's talking about because I never, as I said, read that book. But now, of course, after reading this autobiographical book, I want to read Edinburgh as well. If you are familiar with the writing process, if you're yourself an author, you probably will be interested to learn how he combined, let's say, his means of living and how he was becoming an author, how it was, struggling sometimes to, for example, work part-time or full-time and then also try to write a book. And if you're interested in that, this book will provide. However, for me, probably the most interesting moment was his essay on gardening. So he found this little apartment in New York with a tiny garden, and he started to work on it. It was his personal project, and I don't know why, but that story reminded me of Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which is also one of my favorite books, of course, classics. I was thinking about Alexander Chee as of this little prince who found himself on this planet, and he is he's a bit lost, just as a little prince. And his meticulous work with the roses in his garden is basically the cope method to survive on this planet and to understand what you are and who you are. And I don't know what about you, if you read this book, what is your favorite essay in this book, but that essay did that to me. And that essay really opened up his soul to me. So I, of course, would love to learn more of his work now. In parallel to all these wonderful physical books, I've also picked an audiobook that I was listening, on the way to work or during my breaks, and that is called A Place for Everything: The Curious History of Alphabetical Order by Judith Flanders. So I think it was my own mistake. I very randomly, it wasn't in my TBR, I very randomly picked that book just because I needed to listen something, and I found on my Scribd, and it was basically in my subscription, so I started to listen to it. I don't remember how exactly I encountered that book first. Maybe somebody told me about it. Maybe it was mentioned in the linguistic podcast that I'm constantly listening. But it is basically a book about how we came up with the order of letters, or at least that's what I thought. So I started to listen to that, and I was a little bit disappointed because I think when you read about language, it is very good idea to actually have a written copy of the book in front of you, because then you can actually see maybe some linguistic nuances and how they are written in words on the paper, because listening to that, for me personally, it was a bit difficult. Again, maybe because I'm not native English speaker, maybe that was a problem. And maybe there were just a lot of new information for me that I couldn't comprehend. And yeah, I don't know why, but that didn't work for me. Another disappointment in this book for me was that the very good part of this book is actually dedicated to the history of writing. And this is not what I wanted to listen to, especially because she was primarily concentrated the history in Europe, although this writing tradition were well developed already in China, for example, in Asia or in Middle East and in America. I mean, again, there's no problem in studying the history of writing in Europe, right? But because it was primarily done in monasteries, for example, by religious people in churches, because of the Bible, and they needed to spread the word of God throughout the whole European cities. Again, nothing wrong with that, but for me, it was not interesting. I was not interested in the, let's say, religious aspect of writing history. And that was a little disappointment for me, let's say. I just didn't expect that at all. I expected to more deep dive into how exactly we decided that after A goes B and after B goes C and etc., and how it works in different languages. The really nice point that I enjoyed in this book is that she mentioned that not actually all languages have the alphabetical order, and I think it is necessary to acknowledge that some languages just don't have it. For example, Korean, they do have letters, but they don't have an alphabetical order. You just have letters. Why do you need an order? So yeah, I found it very interesting. And yeah, again, I'm sure it's a great book if you actually read the physical one. Maybe one day, if I have time and opportunity, if I find it in my hands somehow, maybe I'll give it a chance, another chance. But for now, I listen to a lot of linguistic podcasts. I'm fine with that. It's actually more than enough, so maybe you can skip that as well. As always, it's up to you. Now, speaking of the language and stories and narratives, if you remember in my TBR, I mentioned that the author actually contacted me and suggested that I read his book. His name is Somdev Chatterjee, and he sent me the copy of How Stories Work. Again, I had a digital copy of this book, and it's not that long. It's over 100 pages or so, and yeah, I very quickly read that one. In case of this book, I think I also had different expectations. So when I read the title, I thought, oh great, now I actually can learn how stories are built in order to affect us. Because sometimes you watch a movie or read a book and you cry, and you kind of understand why you cry, because for example the dog is killed, or the child is hurt, or I don't know, somebody's dying from cancer, and you understand it consciously even. But yeah, I thought that I would actually get to the instruments of that. But then there's actually a little subtitle of this book. It says The Evolutionary and Cognitive Roots of the Power of Narrative. And then, so when I started to read it, I realized, oh, it's actually like the neuroscientific approach almost to how the stories work. And I started to think that, oh, okay, that's actually a huge subject. And I was not sure that 100 pages were enough for that. And I think that's true. I think if you really wanted to dive deep into the subject, you need like 500 pages or so, but maybe editors were very strict about that. So yeah, sorry about that. But nevertheless, it is a very nice overview of, let's say, main, and I would say even mainstream ideas, how we approach stories nowadays. And if in the beginning of the book, even before finishing reading this subtitle of the book, I thought there's going to be a lot of reference to Aristotelian poetics, or for example Shakespeare and the researchers who were studying Shakespeare all their lives. At the end, I realized that there were a lot of reference to, for example, Jordan Peterson and Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in neuroscience, I think. So it was definitely a more modern approach. Aristotle is still there, of course, but I still think that Somdev was trying to make this more scientific, more positivistic approach to the storytelling and story perception. But I do believe that you should dive deep. I think you need to find some unique researches. I'm sure there are a lot of people who study how we're affected by the stories and etc. But I had an impression all the time that it's such a Yuval Noah Harari approach to the storytelling, So just as an author of Sapiens is trying to dig deep into the beginning of our human society and find out the answers to the questions that we have right now. I think Somdev is trying to do similar approach, let's say, and he's like looking at the, for example, prehistorical period of humanity and how maybe storytelling was already in natal state at that time, or maybe like in full development actually, but just never written. I mean, I'm up to it. It's fine, but I do believe that we actually went further, a lot further from that. Even if 1,000 years ago we had this natural inclination into storytelling, which is, yeah, that's maybe true. I'm not sure that we have the same approach to the stories right now. And he mentioned that actually in the book. He said that obviously if in the past stories could actually help us to survive, nowadays we don't need the stories to survive. It may work for us on this, neuron level that we might need them in order to survive and go through the day. Yes, maybe. But I think we also start to think more critically. I think we're also trying to connect the stories and make sense of them. And stories are always, subjective, and some stories can work very well for one group of people and not so well for another. And I think it's just such a complex subject that you cannot simply and fairly write about it and get done with it. And since the author of this book, Somdev Chatterjee, is the professor in the Kolkata University and he teaches the narrative in cinematography, I understand that this book is actually good for a very beginning level students of, for example, narrative classes, or I don't know how you call it in the universities. Yeah, that's actually a good thing to think about it. And the last little thing that I just want to quickly mention, and if the author is watching this video, hi, hello, thank you very much for writing and sending me this book. But just for the next time, and maybe it's actually a question to your editor as well, it is not necessary to retell the whole plot of Breaking Bad. First of all, because for some people it can be a spoiler, and for others who know this show very well, or for those who even watched it one time, they know exactly what's going on in Breaking Bad. So you don't actually need to explain that on the pages, because 2 pages for Breaking Bad is more than enough when your book is just 100 pages. So yeah, maybe take that into consideration for your next work. Apart from that, if you are interested in something like an introductory level book about how narrative works, why not? Pick that one. I will continue to maybe find similar works, non-fictional works. I enjoy reading such things. I will report you whenever I find it and whenever I'm reading it in my following videos. Okay, now let's move on to the bestseller blockbuster of contemporary literature, which is If We Were Villains by M.L.Rio. As already mentioned in my TBR, we were reading this book for a book club in July, and it was, I have to admit, one of the most wonderful discussions that we had about books and about one specific work. But I have to admit, I've done my homework. I watched a couple of videos on YouTube about this book, and I've listened to podcasts about it. So I was prepared for the book club, let's say. And again, I have no literary degree, and I've never, let's say, extensively read Shakespeare. The only work that I read by Shakespeare is Macbeth, and it is just because the image of the Queen Macbeth washing her dress is such a popular reference in a lot of artworks, and that basically sent me to Shakespeare. But I never actually studied it. But M.L.Rio did, and she proved indeed that she was a great student of Shakespeare studies. Without a doubt, this book is a tribute to Shakespeare and to his wonderful body of work that he left behind, and it was fun to read it. We also had a discussion during the book club that maybe it's an overkill that they were quoting Shakespeare all the time, or not just quoting, speaking in Shakespearean lines. But I thought that's actually, it is the only acceptable and suitable circumstances in which you can speak Shakespearean language, because the characters of this book are actually performance students. They study how to act in the theater, for example, on the stage. It is natural that they learn by heart all the plays of Shakespeare, and I think it is also kind of natural that they squeeze in all these lines in their daily conversation, and I found it actually entertaining. Again, for me those moments were quite difficult because it's difficult for me still to read Shakespeare as for non-native English speaker. But anyways, the book by M.L.Rio, let's go back to that. It is well written. It was surprisingly easy to read despite the Shakespearean lines. The plot is very interesting. The dark academia, apparently I have no problem with that if you consider it as a whole separate genre or aesthetics or whatever you call it. I think probably I only had problem with The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is I don't know, the book that I still think is very pretentious, very white, and very, I don't know, like, not relatable, and I don't want to be related to those people at all. Whilst what M.L.Rio did is still probably not the strongest female characters, but what she did with male characters I personally enjoyed. She gave them this complexity, these different layers, akin Shakespeare, I would say, but just don't quote me on that comparison, okay? But again, it's a great book. It was so much fun to discuss it and to hear different opinions on different subjects. Maybe it's a gender representation, class representation, race representation. Everything is a good subject in this book. But again, considering the fact that I'm probably very late to this train, and I'm sure that I have an impression that everybody already read this book, and I'm like probably the last one who read it last month. So probably you already know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, if that happens, you can actually pick that up. I can guarantee you a fun time. Maybe you're not gonna fall in love with that, but yeah, just a nice thriller, let's say, or a detective story, a little bit of thrill, why not? I enjoyed that. And now to the behemoth of my wrap-up video is obviously The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Honestly, I don't want to talk about this book without the coupling it with another one, and I already told about it in my TBR. So let's talk about not just Heart of Darkness, but also An Image of Africa by Chinua Achebe. And Chinua Achebe is right. This book is racist. Should we forgive him for all the scene and read him anyways in order to enjoy beautiful English? Well, it's a personal choice, but this is not the choice for me, because I didn't enjoy that English. That English is what, like the end of 19th century, the beginning of 20th century? Okay, great. But I read a lot of wonderful books that were written in that time period, and they were easy to understand, they were fun to read. As usual, the first thing that I do, I blame my English. And I do believe that I cannot appreciate the beauty of English that probably Joseph Conrad, mastered in his life. But again, I'm sure if you're listening to me, you're not here for me describing how beautiful English language is, because I'm not the person to assess that. But what you can expect from me is the discussion of the plot, for example, or the concept of the book, or the history behind it. And what I expected from that book is this plot where the character descends into madness. This is what I heard about this book, but I didn't notice it. And I think there are so many authors that done it better than Joseph Conrad, that where you actually see that in the language, you see it in the sentence construction, you see it in maybe the structure of the formal structure of the text, many things. In this case, I couldn't find it. Maybe it's just me, I don't know, uneducated, stupid person who doesn't understand Joseph Conrad, but I'm sorry, it didn't work for me. And I felt very uncomfortable when there was such a big difference between describing the person of color that he encounters in his adventure on this river, no named river, and when he described, for example, white people that he encounters. And I know that they are white because he actually mentions the whiteness of their skin, or for example, hair, the light color of their hair or whatever. So yeah, I felt very uncomfortable. I couldn't forgive Joseph Conrad for that. And I completely agree with Chinua Achebe with the fact that allegedly this book is written about the colonization of African states, and his character in Heart of Darkness is basically this person who encounters colonization. And indeed, you can easily interpret this work of literature as the criticism of colonialism. But to be honest, colonialism is such a traumatic experience of so many people in the world that I think we should start first with a non-fictional work, maybe, with the historical records, who done what and when and how exactly and who was involved. And only after that we can maybe, fantasize about the fictionalized version of that. I think we should be very sensitive and very careful with this history of our humanity. And, I appreciate Joseph Conrad and what he's done in his personal life, that he learned English as a second language, that he achieved such level of mastership. Kudos for that. We need to take into consideration what exactly he wrote on those books. It's just we as responsible readers, again, should not limit our knowledge of colonialism and, the horror of it based only on Heart of Darkness. We should actually maybe go to non-fictional works, historical books, learn about it from that perspective, and only then apply this knowledge in criticizing or interpreting Heart of Darkness. Anyways, I know that this book is loved by many people, and it is studied in the universities as far as I know, especially in the Western universities, English-speaking universities, when they study literature, for example. I'm certain that they also discuss the problematic side of this book. I'm sure, I hope so. But as a casual reader, I don't know. Maybe you could just skip it. It's not the classic that I would say highly recommended, must read. No, for me, that wasn't the case. And yeah. So yeah, if you, however, have maybe the opposite opinion, or if you want to support my opinions and let me know about it in the comment section, I would be happy to receive your message. So yeah, you can go down in the comment section and say something to me. Say hi. So yeah, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed that. Now it's time for us to prepare our little lunch and maybe play some table games with my friends, and then exchange your gifts for the birthdays. So yeah, I'm gonna have fun, but you please do too, and you stay safe and fun and so beautiful as you are. Have a great rest of the day, have a great rest of the night, have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you hopefully very soon. Bye!